I was pretty decided that I wanted you to take over, even though I didn't say like, oh, this is going to happen. And I kind of, for me, as Andrea and I, my wife, we had planned on going back to the States. I had kind of an agreement with my wife that I would be in Brazil for 5 years and we'd go back to California. It was pushing, 5.5, 6 years. And I wanted to be closer to my parents, and I was like a really big priority in my life. Right. And so that was something that, having my kids grow up close to my parents was critical. And so I made the decision, and I think it was a great decision for my life. And I'm happy that we transitioned in the next kind of stage and you were able to kind of lead the way after I left. Let's talk about, because it's kind of funny, right after I announced that I was leaving, and I've talked about this on other podcasts before, going back a couple of years before that, we were a small startup, and I remember having a conversation with a guy by the name of Mickey Malka. Mickey Malka is the founder of Ribbit. He, has founded several other companies, Patagon, which sold for $750 million right before the dot-com bust back in, 99 or 2000 or whenever it was. And he had a conversation with him, and he said, Brian, you should buy Zap, he told me. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, we're this tiny little company. They're 10 times bigger than us, like in revenue. Like, how does that even make sense? And he was like, yeah, I mean, when we were building Patagon, we went, we bought our biggest competitor and made it happen. And so it was a realization for me that, so I went out and I approached Zap, and, at the time, I think it was laughed off pretty hard there. I didn't really hear back from Eduardo at the time, which, was the CEO of Zap. And fast forward a couple of years later, I think we gained a lot of traction. There was some mutual respect for what they had done. We're doing some things better than us, and we recognized that, around data and other things. And we, they came back a couple of years ago and said, hey, let's have this conversation. Right around that time, I was making the transition, right? And so it was interesting because I was moving out of my role, and then they kind of, express interest around a very similar time. Talk about what you remember those early kind of conversations with them, and how that, kind of negotiation happened in your mind, or any other context you think is interesting for anyone.
Sure. I remember that one thing that you were personally struggling with was your role, because you knew you had to give me the autonomy to execute, but at the same time you were still an executive chairman, and you were trying to figure out what that position was. And today, with our experience, it's so clear the importance, right? And of course we have, I don't know, maybe now here in Brazil, Guilherme Benchimol has just moved to an executive chairman role, right? And it's so clear how critical that is for their execution moving forward. And there are multiple examples, like Luiz Helena Trajano in Magazine Luiza and Itaú. So, and maybe we have those examples for bigger companies, but there is a long-term strategic agenda that always makes sense for someone to have that priority, kind of number one priority, especially when you have an internal priority for a CEO to take care of. And as everyone can imagine, succeeding a founder CEO, of course, it takes time for you to build trust, to address the market, the company, the reports, executive team, to take over the strategic guidance and direction, everything. So it was exactly, so that conversation with Zap, it kind of started. So of course there was that previous conversation, but they came back right after, right? We officially transitioned, and then you took over. So it was great because you basically led that conversation. And of course, when you talk about merging two companies, a merger of equals, looking at the operations and involving the executive team and understanding the two businesses. Of course, it's important, but there is a need, especially in our case with multiple investors having to invest time with the investors on the other side, which is Grupo Global. Of course, it takes time to really understand, build trust there. So it is a full-time job, definitely. And so that's what I recall. It was the timing worked in our favor to really help us take over our new roles and fully engage both of us with the main priorities. And of course, we had lots of trust, and it helped us perform well, the fact that we contribute to one another, right? But it gave that clarity also to the executive team that you were definitely away from the day-to-day business. And I think it just contributed to the execution right after that conversation, right after the succession, and then conversation, and then closing.
I remember a conversation I had. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. And if we were to fast forward, because that was end of 17, we closed, and then 18, it's all about integration. And of course, I personally had to focus 100% internally. And then 19, let's start fundraising, and then we talk to multiple investors. And you now in this new investor, in this new cap table, a new board structure, you also had a more intense role helping the whole team navigate that new governance. And again, fundraising, new investors, and eventually OLX investors. So I think this whole journey after the merger, we had different stages, very different stages, but in other structures and other governance structures could have worked. So if you were the CEO, if you had not moved to the United States, you would probably remain as the CEO of Viva Real and ZAP and lead the sale, and I would have a different role. And maybe I don't know, I was the COO before being promoted to CEO. So maybe I would retain that position of COO, but doing exactly what I did as CEO, because you would have to be committed to that agenda, right, that you did. So it was more of a labeling as executive chairman and CEO, but both roles were critical, right? And over time, it's even more critical to have that strong board investor, very long-term agenda.